Stop. Okay. All right, I think we're going to start. Welcome everyone to this lecture with Professor Bron Taylor from the University of Florida. My colleague Erik Myggen Duplessis from the Department of Business and Social Sciences, and myself, Laura Feld, from the Department of Language, Culture, History and Communication. That's a new name. That's why. We're very, very pleased that you accepted our invitation to come. And the lecture is funded by the SDU Climate Cluster and hosted by DIAS and the Environmental Humanities Network, the department, and of course the study of religion. We would like to thank the Climate Cluster and Sebastian Mernil for the opportunity to invite Bron Taylor. And unfortunately, he couldn't be here today for very good reasons, a very busy colleague. Bron Taylor is a professor of religion and nature at the University of Florida. He's also been an affiliated scholar with the Center for Environment and Development at the University of Oslo, and he is also a fellow of the Rachel Carson Center in Munich. Bron Taylor works mainly in the areas of religion and ecology, environmental ethics, environmental history, and environmental philosophy. He's a prominent historian of religion and ethnographer of environmentalism, and especially radical environmental movements, surfing culture, and nature-based spiritualities. You're also the editor-in-chief of the indispensable two-volume Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, and founder of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, serving as its president for 4 years, and you also founded the affiliated Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, and you have served as its editor for many years. In 2017, you were recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture.
Yeah, as if that weren't enough. You've written several books, among which are Dark Green Religion, Nature, Spirituality, and Our Planetary Future, Avatar and Nature, Spirituality, and Ecological Resistant Movements. And as a social scientist, I find your work fascinating for understanding social movements, their aspirations, their motivations and their struggles, but also more broadly, perhaps the sort of green logic that seems to be kind of the new spirit of capitalism these days, spearheaded by companies like Patagonia and also sort of creeping into our politics everywhere and helping us make sense of that. And as a surfer, myself, a fellow surfer, your work on surfing and nature spirituality has helped me figure out why it is I like it so much. So thank you for that. And without further ado, here's Bron Taylor.
So thank you both so much, and to all who participated in making this possible. It is a great honor to be here. See how fancy your school is and how seriously you're taking the sustainability imperatives of the day. Like many of you, my worries about anthropogenic climate change has been long-standing. For me, it began in 1990 when I read Bill McKibben's The End of Nature and the first assessment on climate change issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Soon after reading these, as a brand new professor at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, I gave an Earth Day talk urging dramatic action in response. It was clear then that if the emerging scientific consensus proved to be prescient, that such action would be needed. Over the years, the IPCC issued a long series of increasingly well-supported and alarming reports, the sixth and most recent of them just last week. With each new report, the normally reserved scientists have been gradually overcoming their reluctance to be called alarmist. And now they are predicting an imminent catastrophe if the human community does not act rapidly and in concert. It's been clear for decades that we know enough about the science and we have the technological tools to address the crisis. So this problem is not a lack of scientific knowledge or technological expertise, but with our values and priorities, which for large proportions of the human community are deeply influenced and constrained by our worldviews, including those embedded with what we call religion. For more than 3 decades, as a scholar who thinks that everything any of us cares about depends on preventing catastrophic environmental change to the climate system, and as a scholar of religion, I've wondered whether religion might contribute to dramatic environmental mobilization. Today I will overview what I currently think based on my own historical and ethnographic research, as well as on analysis of a growing body of research conducted by others. My interest in religion and environmental change began decades ago with a broad curiosity about the role that religion plays in social change. Of course, religion often reinforces the social order, which Karl Marx famously recognized when observing that the ruling ideas of any age are ideas that tend to serve the interests of rulers and social elites. Sometimes, however, contra Marx, religion subverts the established order. This is why, in part, I became interested in liberation theology, which fuses leftist social analysis with the prophetic social justice tradition found in Judaism and Christianity. This is also why I became interested in the role of religion in civil rights and wrote my first book about civil rights and affirmative action laws and policies. But I was struck that even after Earth Day, few Christians prioritized protecting nature. This is true also of all the world's predominant religions, which I will call world religions for shorthand. After researching the relationship between religions and environmental behavior for decades, I've arrived at the opinion that the world's religions have been slow to develop pro-environmental priorities because there are ideas and practices endemic to them that hinder their ability to do so. Many know about this famous article by the historian Lynn White, which played a major role in precipitating the emergence of the entire field of interdisciplinary environmental studies. White is best known for arguing that 2 Christian themes that are also shared by Judaism and Islam, which he did not discuss, contribute decisively to environmentally destructive attitudes and behaviors. First, the belief that only humans are created in the image of God and they therefore have superior moral value to all other living things. Second, the prohibition on idolatry, namely worshiping anything other than God. This led to the suppression of nature-based spirituality such as paganism and animism. This also often involved the forced conversion of people with such spiritual beliefs, as well as the destruction of sacred groves or other places and practices important to them. This helps to explain why sacred groves were so often destroyed. The tradition certainly was not characterized by arborphilia, by the love of trees. More generally, White made this broad assertion: since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. Despite his critique of Orthodox Christianity, White thought there had been and were versions of the tradition that could be used as a foundation for a green Christianity. Moreover, like others then and now, he thought that Buddhism and animistic spiritualities were naturally more eco-friendly. Although White did not initiate the view that Abrahamic religions promulgate environmentally destructive beliefs and behaviors, he advanced his critique in a widely disseminated scientific journal in 1967, just as environmental alarm and the exposure to alternative non-Western worldviews was spreading. This led to soul searching, initially and especially among Christian intellectuals, and before long among a few religious thinkers from the world religions, about why their traditions do not seem to make protecting nature a religious priority. This soul searching led some such thinkers to search their traditions for environmentally friendly themes, and to argue that, properly understood or appropriately reformed, their religions can and should enjoin conservation. Sometimes these thinkers fused this to concerns for social justice. As a result, efforts to nurture and spread green versions of these traditions grew internally, as well as through interfaith encounters, some of which were invented specifically for this purpose. My efforts to understand the role of religion in environmental behaviors have included orchestrating the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature and founding the International Society for the Study of such relationships and its affiliated journal. For my purposes today, it's important to note that since the early 1990s, some scholars have taken efforts to turn religion green to be strong evidence that religions are entering an ecological phase. Organizations such as the UK-based Alliance of Religion and Conservation, which has enjoyed the support of members of the British royal family, and the UK-based Forum for Religion and Ecology, exemplify such efforts and those who make optimistic claims about the greening of world religions. Other elite sectors have also been cited as evidence of such a trend, including the writings of Pope Francis and conferences and publications orchestrated by agencies under the United Nations umbrella, such as Faith for the Earth, which in 2020, the United Nations Environmental Program published in a collaboration with the Parliament of World Religions. In 2016, I even participated in a seminar in Tehran, which was orchestrated by the UNEP and the Environmental Department of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The seminar's objective was to promote sustainable development through interreligious dialogue. The Iranians were gracious hosts, eager to show off the beauties of their city, as here at Tehran's Nature Bridge Park, while also portraying Iran as an environmental government. Even the country's then president, Hassan Rouhani, appeared under tight security to endorse the event's sustainability objectives and assert that they cohered with Islamic principles. When listening to him, I was impressed at what a good politician he was. He knew his international audience and how to connect with the Greens among them. The gathering also made me wonder whether I was, in fact, witnessing the greening of religions that had become the ardent hope of many scholars and religious environmentalists. Later that year, I reflected on the event in the journal that I publish. The same year, I published 2 articles that, I've been told, provide a benchmark for understanding the scholarly and popular ferment over religion and environmental behavior. The first of these, The Greening of Religious Hypothesis Part 1, explored the history of this ferment. It demonstrated, among other things, that the ferment has been going on longer and is more diverse than is commonly recognized. In my view, one of the earliest figures who helped to precipitate this ferment, if indirectly, was Louis Feuerbach. In The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841, and based on his own experiences with the tradition, Feuerbach wrote that nature, the world, has no value, no interest for Christians. He added, the Christian thinks only of himself and the salvation of his soul. Perhaps even more famously, he suggested, presaging future anthropologists, that religion originates with anthropomorphic projection when he wrote, man makes God in his own image. Others famously rejected the Abrahamic religions in favor of religions of nature, including, in the mid-19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. But none of the early critics voiced the critique in more scathing detail than the Scottish-American conservationist John Muir. Muir's family immigrated to Wisconsin when Muir was a child. He grew up in a devout Calvinist family and knew the Bible exceptionally well, having been forced to memorize it as a child by his lay preacher father. In the 1860s, he took his now famous long walk to the Gulf from Wisconsin, experiencing both discomfort and dangers along the way. After catching what was probably malaria after reaching Florida's Gulf Coast, in 1867 he wrote Cedar Keys, which I consider to be one of the most important essays in U.S. environmental history. In it, he attacked what he considered to be the conceited Christian view that the entire world was made only for man. He considered such beliefs to be both delusional and at the root of environmentally destructive behaviors. I will now quote several passages to give you a visceral feel for Muir's views as well as his sardonic humor. The world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all the facts. A numerous class of men are painfully astonished whenever they find anything, living or dead, in all God's universe which they cannot eat or render in some way what they call useful to themselves. To such people, whales are storehouses of oil for us to help out with the stars in lighting our dark ways until the discovery of the Pennsylvania oil wells. But if we should ask these profound expositors of God's intentions, how about those man-eating animals, lions, tigers, alligators, which smack their lips over raw man? Or about those myriads of noxious insects that destroy labor and drink our blood? Doubtless man was intended for food and drink for all these. Oh no, not at all. These are the unresolved difficulties connected with Eden's apple and the devil. If this is true, then, why do so many minerals poison him? Why are so many plants and fishes deadly enemies? Why is the Lord of creation, again a sardonic reference to biblical expressions of human domination, subject to the same laws of life as his subjects. Oh, all of these are satanic or in some way connected with the first garden. Muir concluded by fusing his scathing critique of illogical theological anthropocentrism with his belief in the value of all life. It never seems to occur to these far-seeing preachers that nature's object, making animals and plants, might possibly be, first of all, the happiness of each one of them, not the creation of all for the happiness of one. Why should man value himself more than a small part of one great unit of creation? And what creatures of all that the Lord has taken the pains to make is not essential to the completeness of that unit, the cosmos? Muir concluded his critique of theological anthropocentrism by stating his belief in the value of all life. The universe would be incomplete without man, but it would also be incomplete without the smallest transmicroscopic creature that dwells beyond our conceitful eyes and knowledge. Muir's words demonstrate how contentious the effort to understand the role in religion and environmental behavior can be. Some of you might have seen the editorial that illustrates this. It was published just yesterday, I think. But what can we learn from history and the social sciences about whether, and if so, to what extent the world's religions are becoming more environmentally friendly? The weight of evidence is that those with profound environmental concerns within the world religions remain a distinct minority. When it comes to environmental understandings and values, religiosity is typically less important than other variables, such as political ideology, educational levels, and the extent to which the wider society is secular. All world religions, whether they emerged in Asia or the Near East, have themes and dynamics that occlude understandings of how environmental systems work. This tends to hinder pro-environmental concern and action. World religions co-evolved with agriculture. They are agricultural societies. Consequently, they value their domestic plants and animals and typically consider wild organisms as threats to their own survival. The review also revealed broad themes that hinder environmental mobilization among world religions, including, first of all, beliefs that a deity or deities control nature. This is one of the ideas that can occlude understandings of human impacts on environmental systems. Based on such beliefs, whether nature is harmful or beneficent is typically related to whether an individual or group is properly aligned with God or the gods, or whether people are properly carrying out their religious duties. Consequently, to ensure a favorable environment, one must appease or please any deities powerful enough and inclined to influence nature. Commonly, sacrifices of plants or animals are considered to be a way to please or appease the divinity. Sometimes, those who are believed to be offending the deity must be converted or suppressed in some way. Given such beliefs, religious people often find it difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that negative environmental change, including catastrophic climate change, is the result of human behaviors, unless those behaviors involve disloyalty to the deity or violate a religious obligation. Secondly, world religions in their mainstreams are deeply anthropocentric. They promote the notion that humans are exceptional, and they typically assume that our species is of greater moral value than other life forms. For the Abrahamic religions, humans alone were created in God's image, and they are to rule, to be regents or stewards over all other living things. For the Dharma traditions, human traditions have achieved the highest spiritual pinnacle short only of enlightenment. I surmise that this perception of superiority erodes identification with and thus empathy for other species. Thirdly, world religions also tend to devalue this world by envisioning divine rescue from it, either promising an extraplanetary post-death home or transcendence from this world and its travails through spiritual practices or meritorious reincarnations. It is, of course, important to recognize that there are themes in world religions that can be and are being used to promote pro-environmental values and behaviors. Indeed, many religious individuals, including scholarly experts in particular religions, have focused on drawing out these themes. A world tour of such themes is beyond the scope of today's talk, which is more focused on whether such themes have significant influence among the religious masses in these traditions. Extant research indicates that such themes are not being effectively used to turn world religions green, and that is in part because religious leaders tend not to prioritize pro-environmental themes, values, and causes. But why? Because religious obligations are considered more important, and understandably, religious leaders tend to prioritize meeting the immediate existential and personal needs of devotees. Moreover, such leaders often shy away from emphasizing themes that can be understood to enjoin pro-environmental behavior for fear of alienating congregants who harbor views that are contrary to the sciences or that contradict conservative, anti-environmental, economic, and political ideologies. Fifthly, and moreover, rarely do those involved in what some call religious environmentalism prioritize political activism toward systemic change. The environmental concerns tend to be restricted to acts of individual virtues, such as environmental consumption as an individual or within one's congregation. It is rare, for example, to hear official pronouncements that one's religious obligations ought to lead congregations to support the politicians and political parties that are known for promoting pro-environmental policies. That the weight of evidence does not demonstrate dramatic greening of the world's religions raises this question: why has there been such optimism expressed about it? As one who's been a close observer of the religion and ecology milieu since 1990, I've come to what I think are some plausible explanations. First, many religion scholars and lay people have generally positive views about religion, or at least about their own religious traditions. This can lead them to fail to notice or to ignore the way religious beliefs and even religious ritualizing leads to environmental injury. Second, people generally desire to be hopeful, which can lead people to fail to notice or to downplay discouraging evidence. Social scientists call such blinders confirmation bias. In short, people who are more likely to notice whatever reinforces what they already believe or wish to believe than to notice disconfirming evidence. Third, scholars seeking hopeful signs tend to focus on hopeful examples and anecdotes. This tendency, which I have seen repeatedly, can be called selection bias. This dynamic is understandable on a human level, but it's unfortunate when scholars succumb to it, and many do. For example, research upon which claims about the greening of religion is based have generally not involved randomized data sets, but instead it's relied on cases where religious individuals or small groups are demonstrably environmentally concerned and active. In short, much of the case for the greening of religion hypothesis is based on pre-screened positive examples or is otherwise merely anecdotal. Unfortunately, such information does not indicate what proportions of a given religious group has environmentally friendly ideals or behavioral practices, nor does it provide a comparative reference point with non-religious groups or other religious groups, nor does it track attitude and behavioral changes over time. Moreover, such information does not demonstrate that religion is responsible for the environmentally friendly ideals and practices where these are demonstrable. Scholars should not, therefore, take at face value the claims by religionists that the environmental concerns and practices of a given group are caused by their religious traditions' ethical ideals. There may be, and I think sometimes is, a defensive and apologetic motivation for such claims, and scholars who study a given tradition are often also participants in them and sympathetic toward them, and subject to the same apologetic impulses. Furthermore, a question that would naturally arise from a perspective indebted to Emil Durkheim is rarely considered by those advancing the greening of religion idea, namely that the environmental concern expressed by religious actors is a reflection of the culture in which the religious actors are situated, not the result of the religion's ethical ideals. Here in Denmark and elsewhere in Scandinavia, for example, one can reasonably ask, to the extent that Nordic churches are responding to the climate crisis, is their religion driving such engagements? Or rather, are such engagements a reflection of the strong environmental concern in Scandinavian societies, or even a strategy to stay relevant during rapidly changing times. Similarly, much of the scholarship celebrating the supposed greening of religion fails to consider other possibly influential, if not decisive, variables that may account for such greening where it can be documented. Clearly, to evaluate the greening of religion hypothesis, a sophisticated social scientific approach is needed. The best scholars, of course, scrupulously focus on evidence and are mindful about when they are on firm evidentiary ground or more involved in speculation and hypothesis generation. There's a fourth rationale for the expressed optimism that I and others I know have heard forthrightly, if negatively expressed, that it is counterproductive to the cause of conservation to question the idea that the world religions are rising to the environmental challenge. Such views could be defended as strategic essentialism, the notion that properly understood a given religion or all religions enjoying environmental protection, or as prefigurative politics, the idea that modeling desired behavior and speaking optimistically about them can contribute to a bandwagon effect and eventually to positive cultural tipping points. I have not, however, seen such arguments advanced to defend optimistic pronouncements. Where then do we see signs that can be accurately considered green religion? Our comprehensive review found that indigenous societies, especially those that have worked out and have managed to maintain much of their traditional beliefs and practices, tend to value the entire community of life, consider non-human organisms as kin, and develop ethics of gratitude and reciprocity toward all these relations. Such cultures, to use contemporary language, fuse traditional ecological knowledge with spiritual beliefs and practices into knowledge and practice systems that tend to produce sustainable livelihoods and prevent the erosion of biological diversity. Of course, given the great number and diversity of indigenous societies and the individuals who constitute them, there are many exceptions to the general tendency, both past and present. And today, many of the exceptions have to do with the extent to which indigenous people have assimilated into the religious and cultural mainstreams of the nations in which they are situated. Many more dynamics could be analyzed and more nuance provided. But to wrap up this brief review of research focusing on world religions, we should not be surprised that religions that co-developed with agriculture did not evolve in ways that valued wildlands or wild creatures, especially those that prey on agricultural plants and animals. Nor should we be surprised, since world religions were not invented to respond to environmental challenges, that they have not been inclined or able to mobilize their devotees to respond effectively to negative anthropogenic environmental changes. Although religions are malleable, they are not infinitely so. And so far it is clear that they are not entering into an ecological phase. It may be, moreover, that religions are inherently slow to change because they profess and express eternal, unchanging truths about the human place in the world and prioritize meeting the religious obligations related to these truth claims. Aware that the world's predominant religions had yet to mobilize significantly in the environmental cause, in 1990, I decided to study the most ardent environmentalists in North America and around the world to see whether religion was inspiring those who were mobilizing. While engaged in this research, comparing my own ethnographic work on radical environmentalists and broader environmental movements and trends around the world, with research by others who are exploring related trends and movements, I noticed patterns within the global environmental milieu. These observations grew into the argument in dark green religion. But what is dark green religion? Now, before turning to that argument, I typically spend a little time talking about what we call the family resemblance approach to religious studies, which, in a nutshell, just broadens the field of view that we take and doesn't perseverate on where the boundary of religion is, but rather just thinks about how do the ways in which scholars look at religious phenomena, how can those be applied to worldviews in general? So we take a very broad approach to understanding what religion is in this talk. So with that brief understanding about the breadth of what we can call religion in mind, I can briefly explain the family resemblances approach to analyzing the emotional and spiritual dimensions of the human experience. This approach involves analyzing the religion-resembling traits and characteristics of social phenomena, again, as I was saying, without worrying where the boundary of religion lies. In Dark Green Religion, I argued that if we begin with a flexible definition of religion, looking in the global environmental milieus for its religion-resembling dimensions, it's possible to perceive a rapidly growing and influential nature spirituality. Specifically, I argued that spiritualities that stress ecological interdependence, involve deep feelings of belonging and connection to nature, and perceive the biosphere as a sacred, Gaia-like superorganism, have been assuming new forms and exercising increasing social and political influence. These sorts of nature-based spiritualities generally cohere with and draw on evolutionary and ecological science, and therefore stress continuity and even kinship among all organisms. They also tend to have animistic dimensions in which communication, if not also communion, with non-human organisms is thought possible. Consequently, these other kind are considered to have intrinsic value, regardless of whether they are useful to us in some way, and they should be accorded respect, if not also reverence. Using these Gaian and animistic perceptions, I argued, is generally a deep sense of humility about the human place in the world, in contrast to anthropocentric conceits, wherein human beings consider themselves to be superior to other life forms and the only ones who count morally. In DGR, I documented how such understandings are being expressed and promoted not only by scientists and environmental philosophers, but also by environmental activists, historians, artists, musicians, filmmakers, nature writers, literary critics, museum and aquarium curators, and many others. I further argued that although such spiritualities are nascent and relatively small compared to the world's predominant religions, they're gaining adherence and cultural traction around the world, promoting pro-environmental policies and behaviors and exercising at least some political influence. Moreover, I suggested these nature spiritualities that are embracing evolutionary and ecological worldviews are more likely to kindle dramatic environmental mobilization than are the world's long-standing religious traditions. What then are the main traits and characteristics common in dark green religion? These traits include beliefs that nature is sacred, all living things have intrinsic value, that all life forms share a common ancestor and thus are literally kin, they're biologically related, all life is interconnected, and these beliefs are woven in with deep feelings of belonging and connection to nature, humility about the human place in the world. And dark green religion also shares certain epistemological assumptions. In other words, they share the view that there are a variety of ways one can arrive at a proper spiritual perception, including about the kinship of all life. These include direct visceral experience in nature, through the sciences, and through the arts. And such spiritualities typically involve perceptions that death is not to be feared but accepted as the necessary wellspring for new life, and they typically involve experiences of awe, wonder, and a love of nature. Such spiritualities also typically have animistic dimensions with regard to non-human organisms and entities. The naturalistic forms draw on ordinary relationships that people have with animals, as well as on ethology, the science of animal consciousness and behavior. These perceptions are typically also blended with holistic metaphysics that cohere with science, and whether conventionally religious in some way or entirely naturalistic, they increasingly lead to the biosphere being revered as Gaia. This chart kind of explains the different types and the blurry lines between them. Now, I've built my argument on diverse methods and evidence, including historical, ethnographic, and quantitative research, as well as cultural analysis, including literature, film, and museum studies. In dark green religion, I also noted that some people within the world's predominant religions and from diverse regions around the world also understand the biosphere as sacred and all organisms as worthy of reverent care. I further suggested that, however unlikely it may seem from the present vantage point, it's conceivable that eventually dramatic international and interfaith cooperation toward environmental conservation may emerge. In other words, religions are malleable, and only time will tell the extent to which they will mobilize in response to the environmental crisis. Now, to provide just a little of the evidence I found, I'm going to turn to some examples from world-class science museums. In January 28, 2008, I visited the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Out front is Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility, who was worshipped and feared for his control not only of rain and fertility, but of destructive forces such as hail and lightning. The most prominent exhibit there introduced the discipline of anthropology. The first panel explained the age of the earth, the second, the evolutionary process. The third included these words: thus, anthropology, through the study of fossil remains and modern primates, can trace the evolutionary relationships, presenting a mirror that reminds us that we are part of the history of the world and the animal kingdom, and not, as we used to believe, that we were created to have nature at our service. Underscoring the connection between human beings and the rest of the animal kingdom was a display of Australopithecus afarensis, an early bipedal hominid, whom scientists consider a human ancestor. Here and elsewhere, the museum curators articulated the view that humans are animals and all organisms share a common ancestor. This was the basis as well of the exhibit's criticism of anthropocentric arrogance and the false earlier view that nature was created only by us, or only for us. The perceptive visitor would recognize that colonial religions were being criticized for promoting just such a misperception. The idea and value of traditional ecological knowledge was explained, and its interrelatedness with the pagan nature spirituality that yet survives in Mesoamerican indigenous communities was acknowledged and portrayed sympathetically. The museum thus blended contemporary biocultural understandings, national pride, and a subtle anti-colonial and anti-theist attitude. Put simply, the museum celebrated the spiritual connections human beings once had and could have again with nature in Mesoamerica. A few years later, I visited the Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town, South Africa. The first thing I saw at the centerpiece of the foyer was a declaration that oceans are sacred, which was connected to an effort to end whaling. In part because, as this banner proclaimed, whales can help us recover our best spiritual selves, wherein we feel connected to and protective of our watery home. Other panels spotlighted our dependence on biodiversity and quoted environmental luminaries such as Rachel Carson's statement expressing wonder toward the beauties of nature and urging humility. This panel on living within a wilder world asserted that understanding our kinship with and sense of belonging to nature is rooted in our common ancestry, and this is why we find peace and tranquility in nature. The panel urged visitors to reconnect to nature through meditative sensory journeys into nature, to experience the timeless processes that sustain all life on Earth, and to recognize our kinship with other lives who have the same needs as our own. Indeed, the curators constructed the entire aquarium to shape perception, to help people experience the wonder and sacredness of nature, while also calling for action to defend whales and the ocean itself. Even the great anti-apartheid activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Archbishop Tutu, got in on the act, helping to launch the Sacred Oceans campaign. For many, the biological sciences provide awe, meaning, and moral guidance. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to just mention that here at the Natural History Museum in New York City, there's a stress on our evolutionary kinship with all organisms through the various sciences that are presented there, looking at homologies, illustrating for the visitors how we share our family resemblances go right into the very bone structure that we share with other organisms. Absolutely fascinating displays. In a complementary way, the Hall of Biodiversity celebrates the diversity of life on Earth while urging action to prevent anthropogenic species extinctions. But more recently, this past summer in Berlin, I attended Theophany and The Bone, two exhibitions held at the Alta Münz Museum. They both exemplify how artists and curators express and promote animistic nature spiritualities. Upon entering the museum's foyer, the first interpretive panel stressed with large letters that planet Earth is blue. The adjacent text explains that the Earth is this color because 70% of its surface is water. The text continued, oceans are places of human longing, and we need oceans, but the oceans don't need us. Then it explained that through its arts, the exhibition seeks to provide a sensual experience to capture the magic of the ocean in the hope of motivating people to protect the largest habitat on Earth, which is indispensable to life as we know it. On the wall adjacent to the entry door of the theater, visitors read that Theophany provides a unique opportunity to listen to oceanic sounds from Antarctica to the Arctic, which the recording artist Chris Watson had collected and orchestrated. A large map illustrated where Watson had made his recordings. In a way that reflects the notion of naturalistic animism that I developed in Dark Green Religion, this text listed as the cast the sea creatures whom Watson recorded, as well as the sources of sound pollution that disturbs and even threatens marine life. By listing the voices of sea creatures as the cast, Watson and his collaborators sought to underscore the agency and value of sea life. Watson was explicit about this during an interview that excerpted in the exhibition's brochure when he explained that through Theophany, he sought to let nature speak for itself. After reading about the experience they were about to have, the exhibition's visitors entered a large space with a mirrored floor. I surmise it was designed to evoke a feeling of being on ice. Then, after finding a beanbag cushion to relax into for nearly an hour, the audience listened. At one point, it seemed that Watson had blended some of the creature's sound into what resembled a religious choir. Meanwhile, ethereal blue lights in different colors floated around the room in a way that seemed designed to evoke a mystical feeling of immersion in the ocean at various depths and during varying conditions. After Theophany concluded, the doors opened to a room with panels created by Friends of the Earth. The displays exemplified this intention by stressing the importance of the ocean and the threats to it and urging action to protect it. Then, after moving through the Friends of the Earth room, there was another especially interesting additional aspect to the exhibition. It was an 18-minute experience titled The Bone, during which people sit in a small boat with virtual reality headsets. The VR headsets provided an experience of flowing through the ocean currents and kelp beds and eventually into a huge salmon skeleton. From inside the salmon skeleton, guests listened to voices purportedly from two salmon. The voices followed an innovative and arguably animistic script. The first of these voices represented salmon displaced from their native Norwegian habitat to salmon farms in Chile where they did not evolve and previously had never lived. This salmon expressed confusion, dismay, pain, and anger at having had their genes violently altered and at losing their freedom as humans incarcerate them in nets where they become sick and riven with psychic and physical pain. This voice was in sharp contrast to the voice of its wild salmon relatives in Arctic waters. The wild salmon explained that in their ancestral waters, they're in proper relationship with all their relations, including the Sami, the indigenous Arctic people, whose salmon-themed songs provided another part of this evocative sensory experience. Theophany's creatives designed the exhibition to give voice to and evoke empathy for marine life and an understanding of the intimate and respectful relationships that humans should have with their oceanic relations. And the lead artist made clear that her hope was to inspire a dialogue between species, and presumably an imaginative one, as in much contemporary animism. Also last summer, I attended an exhibition at the Pompidou Center in Paris that was titled Worlds of Networks. This exhibition examined technological and biological networks and the history of human insights about them. It included panels focusing on the interconnectedness of forests, such as Suzanne Similard's research illuminating how mycorrhizal networks connect and enable trees to communicate in their own arboreal ways. The most stunning part of the exhibition involved an audiovisual presentation that fused a beautifully choreographed, breeze-influenced image of a tree with an imaginatively scripted arboreal voice, said to be from Quercus. Here is a part of what Quercus had to say.
You probably are surprised to hear me speaking. You've always imagined us as incapable of intelligence, language, empathy. You can think of me only as a raw material to build your world. You have spent the last years and decades trying to acknowledge the rights of animals. You have extended your human privileges to them. Now, we are claiming those rights To you, I am Quercus. I am a deciduous tree. That means I throw away my leaves during the winter. This allows me to resist the seasonal cold much better, and to live where other comrades cannot. The fact that I can get rid of parts of my body must be incomprehensible to you. You guard every inch of your body jealously, because if you lose it, you can no longer grow another. I'm throwing them away because I can rebuild everything. My body is a constant accumulation of tissues, an alternation of dead parts, wood, and living cells. There is no struggle between the living parts and the dead ones in us. Death is not an external event which we must oppose or escape. My body is with you and in your life in the most unexpected forms. I am the chair in which you sit, the table you use to write, your wardrobe, your sideboard, but also your most ordinary and extraordinary tools. We are in you as much as outside you. You just have to breathe. The oxygen that is contained in the air you inhale at any time is only a byproduct of our metabolism, and yet it is only through this detritus of our existence that you are alive. To breathe means immersing yourself in our life and being penetrated by our aerial selves. Every breath is an intimate communion with us. Our whole body is built on the energy coming from outside of the closed system you call Earth. We get our food from the sun. For us, to build a body means to capture energy from the stars. Every tree or plant is therefore an agent of assimilation of extraterrestrial matter into Gaia's mineral body. It is only through our act of cosmic digestion that you can assimilate nutrients. I hope it is clear at this point. We fabricated the very conditions for your existence. Wood is not just dead fabric that gives structure. It is also, and above all, a historical archive of the Earth's climate. This is why we are not extraneous to your culture. We are archives of the climate that record every slight variation in the environment. We are taking notes of what you do. You just have to pay more attention to our language, the way we communicate, the way we are.
The Italian artist who founded Studio how do you pronounce it? Forma Fantasma and produced Quercus provide another remarkable example of an animist imagination, as they insisted that humans should listen carefully to trees. You can find, that's just an excerpt of this mesmerizing video, which you can find on Vimeo. In this, they expressed a similar sentiment to Richard Powers in his Pulitzer Prize-winning arboreal novel, The Overstory. In Powers' novel, trees and nature itself has something to tell us, and we must learn how to listen. I wrote about the animistic religion of life that Powers expressed in his book in an essay that revealed the real-life characters upon which he drew. With more time, I could illustrate in far more detail the stunning creativity through which people today are expressing their love and reverence for life, whilst urging us to respond accordingly. But for now, I must wrap up. The overarching question I have sought to answer for decades now is what might mobilize our species to respond effectively to the negative anthropogenic environmental changes that is precipitating what is now called the sixth great extinction, whilst also leading to the collapse of human societies already, with all the suffering that entails in a process that is rapidly accelerating. I have come to the view that how we understand our place in the cosmos and biosphere and our responsibilities to it plays a significant role in the negative environmental trends and the possibility of reversing them. If, as the anthropologist Roy Rappaport said, maladaptive cultural systems kill their hosts, then either we will transform our societies in ways that make the living systems we are part of and depend upon healthy and resilient, or there will be fewer of us, and perhaps none of us. There's no guarantee our species will even survive, and there's no rational person to expect divine rescue from our life, from our little place in space, the only place we know for sure that life exists. Nothing is more important, in my view, than learning our planetary manners, and we better get on with it. Thank you for your time and attention and the invitation. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation both in the next few minutes and over the next several days.
Thank you so much, Bron, for this super
pleasure.
stimulating lecture.
You're welcome.
And I'm also looking forward to the discussion, and we have microphones that can go around. Yes.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I have a kind of a question or comment, really. The dark green religion, in a way I don't really see this as religion. I see it really as a sensitive, artistic, secular view on the world. Religion to me implies something very different. I don't see that as a religious movement, but as something else.
Sure. Well, I say in the book that when we take what we call this, I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but when we take what we call a family resemblance approach to social phenomena, we use the tools of the social and natural sciences to evaluate social phenomena, and what we discover is that a lot of the stuff that happens in the so-called secular world resembles religion. So it certainly doesn't matter to me whether this dark green spirituality, these dark green worldviews, it doesn't matter to me one whit whether one wants to call it religion or not. It really just depends on what your definitions are. Most of us have a definition of religion that's based in the notion that religion involves a belief in invisible divine beings of some sort, right? But that's not necessarily the case.
But more, religion is also sort of a collective sharing of culture as well. It's not just, so it's more than just a belief in the divine. It's a cultural thing which has some commonalities between those members that are a part of a religion.
Well, religions are all, even if at any given religious tradition we look at, they're always very plural and internally contested, right? So they're very complicated phenomena. What I think I was trying to get at with the Dark Green Religion book is that there's emerging diverse forms of nature-related spiritualities, some of which appear obviously to be religious, where people still believe in, we could take the notion of pantheism. The world as a whole is divine. And some people take the Gaia hypothesis to be an example or exemplary of the idea of the Gaia hypothesis that James Lovelock articulated. Others reverence the biosphere in a completely naturalistic way and may draw on Gaia as a kind of metaphor for the interrelatedness of life within the biosphere that we should respect. So there's a blurry, the religion scholars and other social scientists also kind of note that there's a blurry line between what's religion and what's not religion. And if you study religion, you realize there's been scores of definitions of religion, which don't always agree with one another. There's a debate about whether to call something religion, you need to have invisible divine beings of some sort. I'm actually not interested in where that boundary is, because in part I'm not smart enough to figure out where the boundary of religion ends and that which is not religion begins. So it's just far more important to me to use the lenses of the social sciences to illuminate social phenomena. And I guess perhaps because I'm a religion scholar and my Aboriginal training is in the study of religion, I find that looking at social phenomena in which people consider themselves to be non-religious, it can nonetheless be illuminating to use the kind of, to look for the traits and characteristics common to what we all would understand to be religion, to look at non-religious phenomena, and we find a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities that might not be obvious at first glance.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I'm a medical doctor. I have no professional knowledge within your field, but nonetheless, I'd like to take a fresh shot on your question, what might mobilize us? My answer would be tentatively, of course, but I'll explain why. Psychedelics as a reply to your answer, what might mobilize us. And I say that because historically, before psychedelics were used very inappropriately as a recreational drug in the 1960s, and eventually every research into the area was shut down, it was used by religions as a way, in a very controlled fashion, by priests or shamans to communicate with the spirits and with nature. And having personally experienced this also, I have to say that it's definitely conveys for the people who try it a very strong sense of connectivity with the world, with the nature. I would propose one hypothesis, and that is that I don't know if it's true, but all the religions that have used psychedelics as a mean to communicate with the gods I would hypothesize that these were the religions which actually still have that sense of connection with nature and are these dark green religions, as you say. And secondly, I would hypothesize, just for the fun of it, just to be a bit controversial also, that if we exchange the altar wine with ayahuasca, then we might see a big mobilization.
Thank you for that comment. No small number of people who have the kinds of perceptions that I'm talking about have had experiences along the lines that you have mentioned. And then if you add that to a kind of evolutionary and ecological science basis and an understanding of what's going on, you get a combination of a kind of a holism that leads people to profound environmental concerns in many cases. An interesting case study in this would be, many of you are familiar with the countercultural figure Stuart Brand. During an LSD trip back in the mid-60s, Stuart Brand had the image of the whole Earth from space. Now, if you know anything about taking pictures of the Earth from space, the camera has to get far enough out to get a picture of the whole Earth. And after having this experience, this image of the whole Earth from space, he created buttons saying, "We want a picture of the whole Earth from space," and he sent them to NASA. And eventually NASA took his advice, took one of their satellite cameras and turned it back to the Earth. And then we got the first image of the whole Earth from space, which went on the cover of Stuart Brand's countercultural whole Earth catalog, the very first one. So that's an interesting anecdote. There's a person who, controversial and gadfly that he is, including by now advocating for nuclear power as one of the strategies to deal with the climate crisis. Nonetheless, there's just an anecdote that's just one example of a person who used mind-altering substances. Sometimes we call them entheogens, that which bring forth the gods, as part of his own path to a very countercultural worldview that has some affinity with dark green spiritualities for sure.
Yes, thank you very much for a highly inspirational talk. Very much along those lines, we just produced a pitch on a post-anthropocentric ontology to the Climate Center here, and inspired by Descolas' work on varying ontologies, etc., etc. Of course, One of the big challenges is, one, to map these tendencies that you do so brilliantly, that we can find in the lives of consumers, of artists, of representations of alternative nature-cultural relationships. But the other challenge is to turn this imagery, this sacred imagery, I would call it, as a sociologist by training, rather than religious, the sacred imagery of the sacred, into a transformative platform from an extraction linear growth-based economy to a circular compensatory and reciprocal economy. And have you been interested in some of these new forms of economic organization? Because my fear is that in a lot of ways, we as modern human beings, we can have the same experiences as you account for here, so to speak, in our spare time, in our daily lives, but we will still be 100% devoted to the linear growth economy in so many of our daily activities. And this is the real challenge. By the way, on April 12th, to the people who are interested, we have another DS talk about sketches to a neo-animist economy by my friend and colleague Eric Arnold. That will be a nice twin to your talk.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. My own, if you want to put it this way, green pilgrimage began by reading the environmental economists such as Herman Daly and Udo Simonis, and people calling for a radical transformation of human political economies. Today, people are talking about, as you well know, there's the degrowth movement and so forth. So clearly, basing human societies on the classical economic goal of increasing the gross national product of a society, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, some people are and including under the UN umbrella, are trying to reframe things. What increases the average human happiness? So there's ways in which you can do that. But really, fundamental economic and technological transformation is exceptionally important, and people are working on it in all sorts of exceptionally creative ways, and often inspired by these kinds of feelings that and sentiments that I've been talking about.
The transformation is necessarily epistemological before it's technological.
Well, we also have these growing movements to ascribe personhood to nature in various ways. The constitutional revisions, for example, in Bolivia and Ecuador are absolutely stunning, of about a decade ago, that built on and went way beyond the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Acts in the United States, and that those movements are now gaining traction around the world. And they, again, have advocates who have these deep personal connections to nature. So this is where I think the wellspring of it is, as you were suggesting, really in human sentiments and aesthetics.
And Gaia is a no less mysterious global force than the market.
For a final question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering, also related to the question you ended your talk with, how we can mobilize our own species. And also, I was also a bit intrigued by your very brief comment on prefigurative politics. Would you see a role for prefigurative politics there, or do you think, like, because many of these kind of initiatives that are kind of prefigurative in the end fail, do you not really see some value there?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I sometimes say that if we knew what was going to make a decisive difference, we would just do it, right? But these are, as you were alluding to, the Gaian system, the biosphere, is a very complex system. And it's so complex we don't fully understand it. We haven't even begun to fully understand it, despite our, ecological sciences, right? Political systems are exceptionally complicated also, and because they're enmeshed in these environmental systems. And we do know a lot about how to manipulate them, but we don't know enough about how to manipulate them, or those of us who care, we would be doing it. And so when it comes to, how do you promote this kind of mobilization? Well, people are trying all kinds of things. Some people are working on the affective or the emotional front, the spiritual aesthetic front, these cultural creatives that I've focused on in a good bit of my work. Some people are just working on the baseline sciences. Some are working on really remarkable technological innovations that could help us that could help us to decarbonize human social systems. Others are filing lawsuits against their governments for their unwise extractive policies, and others are working on creating or protecting democracy, without which we will not be able to, even if we can convince the majority of humankind to act on these things, without which we will not be able to do it, because the plutocracies in place will prevent action, because people who have a lot of wealth and power generally want to protect it. So at the end of the Dark Green Religion book, I talk about the kind of social science of tipping points. And we don't know what those are, but we know that they can unfold very rapidly and in surprising ways, both for good and ill. I've had whiplash in recent years in the United States to see how rapidly the right wing has gained cultural traction. And in places that voted for Obama, for example, now turned around and voted for Trump and are even going more in a right-wing direction. Those of you in Europe who've done a little history, you know how quickly fascism arose in Germany in the late 20s and 30s. It doesn't take long for things to go haywire, to go very negative, and it doesn't take long, it need not take long for things to go dramatically in a positive direction. Now, if we speak metaphorically, and I would speak metaphorically in this way, some others might speak more spiritually, but I'm going to speak more metaphorically. The earth is speaking to us with an increasingly loud voice, just through the ways in which our environmental systems are changing. Even in the United States, where we've had this really rabid anti-climate change kind of ideology, where, including by religious people who said it's hubristic of us to think that when God's in control, that we can in any way negatively impact the climate if God doesn't allow it. Well, those sorts of voices over the last really 5 to 10 years have really started to shrink into the background. They may still fight any action on climate change, but it's become so ridiculous to argue that the climate isn't changing that those voices are kind of retreating into the shadows. That's a big change. I thought it might really get going after Katrina. It nudged in that direction a little bit after Katrina, the great hurricane, but really over the last 5 years with the acceleration of fires, drought, more hurricanes, and so forth, it's just the climate crisis is increasingly difficult to ignore. And moreover, for really the first time in the last 5 or so years in my country, at least the Democrats are talking about the climate as an existential threat to human civilization. So now over here, I'm quite aware that folks have been talking and recognizing that quite a bit longer, generally speaking. So I think we're beginning to see the possibility of rapidly accelerating tipping points here. Scientists talk about these days they're using the phrase, environmental historians, about the great acceleration of environmental degradation, which is exceptionally alarming. It's possible that there's going to be a great acceleration in human understanding in response to this crisis. And if not, then the suffering will just be multiplied, as the recent IPCC report says, in ways that none of us really here can countenance or fathom. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Eric.